Middle? Yeah? Lower so that it's a little bit.
Okay, that's fine.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to our event commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I do that on behalf of the High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, and with many thanks also to the Department of Public Information, who have been very supportive of this. Now, Mrs. Bachelet and the High Commissioner and the Secretary General and indeed the President of the General Assembly all held their own event on commemorating the 70th anniversary in Marrakesh today, and in connection with the Global Compact on Migration. Now, our event today, we want to focus on three other cutting-edge areas where the challenges to human rights are particularly acute now and are likely to become even more so in the years to come. and they involve climate change, digital space, and economic inequality. But before we get to that point, I would like to show you two very short messages. First, from the UN Secretary General, and secondly, from the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
For 70 years, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been a global beacon, shining a light for dignity, equality, and well-being, and bringing hope to dark places. The rights proclaimed in the Declaration apply to everyone, no matter our race, belief, location, or other distinction of any kind. Human rights are universal and eternal. They are also indivisible. One cannot pick and choose among civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Today, we also honor the human rights defenders, risking their lives to protect people in the face of rising hatred, racism, intolerance, and repression. Indeed, human rights are under siege around the world. Universal values are being eroded. The rule of law is being undermined. And now more than ever, our shared duty is clear. Let us stand up for human rights for everyone, everywhere. Thank you.
"70 years ago, upon the ashes of countries devastated by war, the Holocaust, and economic depression, world leaders devised a plan. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was conceived as a detailed map to guide the world's people out of conflict and suffering and ensure that relations within societies and between states could be sustainable and peaceful. The Declaration inspired liberation movements and led to better access to justice, social protection, economic opportunities, and political participation. Wherever respect for its commitment has been present, the dignity of millions have been uplifted, suffering prevented, and the foundations laid for a more just world. We need to keep pushing forward. People are increasingly fearful of the great changes our world is experiencing, and it is precisely at times of turmoil and uncertainty that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can guide us. Step by step, it lights the path. We need more respect, greater justice. We need to uphold human equality and dignity. And we can achieve this. All of us, wherever we are, can make a difference by standing up for everyone's human rights.
Great. Now, I don't think I'm alone in this room, probably, in thinking that the Universal Declaration is among, and quite possibly the noblest document ever written. Of course, written and agreed upon in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, but also very much bearing in mind the miseries of the Great Depression, very, very much in their minds as well. It covers the entire spectrum of human rights, economic, social, and cultural, and civil and political. And the drafters hoped that by elucidating those universal principles, and they are truly universal, whatever some people say, they believed that they were trying to prevent the conditions that could give rise to another war of the magnitude that they had just seen. Those rights are not just aspirational, because they have subsequently been crystallized into a whole myriad of international treaties, national constitutions, policies and frameworks that actually make the world as we know it, and certainly as it should be. And I believe that the drafters were absolutely right in thinking that their principles would stand the test of time. And there is no doubt in our mind that the principles of the Universal Declaration are as relevant now as they were 70 years ago, even if there are some groups that are perhaps not adequately covered, such as women, children, disabled, LGBTI, and prisoners. Our panel today will discuss issues, however, that the drafters of the Universal Declaration could not have imagined. Climate change is one, digital space is second. And while they were, of course, fully acquainted with massive economic inequality, I doubt they could have envisaged it could have been quite so extreme as it is now. For this meeting, we are very happy to have the head of the New York office of Amnesty, Shireen Tadros, but it is slightly in her previous capacity as an award-winning television journalist for Al Jazeera and Sky News that she's kindly agreed to be the presenter and the mediator, not mediator, the moderator for today's panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gilmour, for that kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here. And let me just say, it's so wonderful to look out and see that this room is full and so many people made the time to come here and discuss this really important subject. And like many of you here today, I've also been thinking a lot in the run-up to this anniversary about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but not so much about whether it's still relevant, but rather I've been thinking about how the very idea that there should be a set of rights that all people have just by virtue of being human beings, and all states should respect no matter what country we're talking about, no matter what's happening in the country, that idea is being questioned by leaders all over the world right now, including, maybe some would say especially, right here in the United States. But worse than that, the idea is being portrayed as idealistic, naive, and against national interests. But the fact is, the UDHR did not emerge from a time of peace and prosperity. It wasn't as if a bunch of states came together and said, let's just write down all the nice freedoms and rights that we're enjoying because, well, it's the moral thing to do. Rather, it came from desperation. Desperation for the bloody events of the Second World War not to be repeated. Desperation that 17 million people that had been exterminated in war and Holocaust, and fear that this could happen again. So in other words, when these leaders thought, how can we ensure peace in our country, but also in the world order, they thought of the Universal Declaration. They thought and decided to have a common standard of achievement for all peoples and for all nations to protect, essentially, themselves. And that link between peace and human rights, and conversely between the lack of human rights and war, that link was so obvious and prevalent back then, yet seems to have been forgotten today. And as a human rights community, and for those who are interested in the protection of human rights, we have to do better at reminding people of the consequences of this collective amnesia when it comes to protecting these principles, because we are sadly failing in that. And as a result, we are witnessing another cycle of war, of death, and a violently insecure world order. In the next hour or so, we'll be looking at some of the challenges of our time and the guidance the UDHR can give us. Are the principles it espouses still relevant in today's digital age? Does the Declaration provide a guide for solving the disaster we face from climate change? Can this seemingly intractable issue of economic inequality be tackled using concepts from the Declaration? Essentially, is the Declaration still a common standard for solving today's urgent human rights issues? But before we get to that and I introduce the panelists, we wanted to quickly just remind you of some of those universal principles that we've been talking about and show you a video that was produced by the UN Department of Public Information. It's called Add Your Voice. And I've been using it a lot with students that I've been speaking to about UDHR, and perhaps also some of you are familiar with it. Essentially, it was a project to ask people around the world to just record a short video of their favorite part of the Universal Declaration and to send it in. And if you are a burning desire that you have to still do this, you can, in fact, record a video and send it on to into the UN system. You just need to go onto the UN website and look for the UDHR video section. Let's take a listen to the video.
All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood.
Men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and to found a family.
Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person.
Everyone has the right to own property, alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property.
Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression.
Nobody shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family.
Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment.
Everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits.
Everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages.
Okay, so how do these principles help in today's complex world when we're faced with challenges that the drafters of the Universal Declaration 70 years ago could never have imagined? Our panel today will help us answer this, and then we'll have some time for questions from you, our audience here, but also if you're watching on the webcast, you can send your questions in via Twitter. Just use the hashtag #AskHumanRights, and I'll put your questions straight to the panelists. Okay, to start us off, let's talk about the use of digital space and the human rights issues around the use of new technologies, be it artificial intelligence, data privacy, or manipulating social media for political or economic ends. Can a 70-year-old declaration, written at a time when our digital age wasn't even a science fiction story, tell us anything? Luckily, we have an expert here to tell us the answers to all these difficult questions, Brett Solomon. Brett is the executive director of Access Now, a global international organization that defends and extends the digital rights of users at risk around the world. Brett will talk us through how we can turn technology into an enabler of rights, reinforcing the rules and reducing risk. Brett, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to the Assistant Secretary General. I'm really so honoured to be here. I'm also, after watching that video, those videos humbled under the weight of its importance. I want to pay tribute at the outset to those who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to those who have fought and even died for it, and to the countless and the nameless who are beneficiaries today of its implementation. In the same breath, I also want to acknowledge and to apologise to those for which it has failed. Let us witness this enduring declaration, the scholars, the precedent, the defenders, and its universal vision of dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the side of history upon which I stand. But, as has been noted, history is moving faster than ever. Technology, its engine, data, its oil. So let us take a moment to stand firm at the 70th anniversary. Let us not listen to all the barbs of its enemies or allow us to be imperiled by the snipers of its abusers. Instead, like a 70-year-old friend, let us honour it and simultaneously acknowledge both its blemishes and its wise wrinkles. Let us also envision what she will look like in 70 years. And how we might also disrupt history's ledger against his violators and in favour of their beneficiaries. And you'll note that I use 3 pronouns in that sentence because I wanted to signal that identity and gender can no longer be understood in binaries. Across, quote, any media and regardless of frontier, Article 19 actually did somehow manage to anticipate the internet and inspire us to celebrate our human rights. They are, as the document says, inalienable, indivisible, and interdependent, but unless they are reinforced with code, encrypted with protocols, programmed with laws, and subject to transparency, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will continue to be hacked. So we are just at the very beginning of the digital revolution, and I want to reinforce that. We are just at the start. And our rights, the very ones that are contained in the 30 articles in the Declaration, risk at times looking more like technology in the back door of our desk, than the open source app store that we are all dreaming that it could be. So my comments today are in 3 sections. First, the rights, then the risks, and then the rules. First, related to our rights, and thank you very much for the moderator's comments, what does our right to privacy mean in the era of ubiquitous data collection and in the midst of countless data breaches and attacks on our personal information? Attacks that we and our families are subject to over and over again. So imagine here the democracy, the healthcare, the Indigenous, the information advocates who are monitored and spied upon relentlessly. How do we exercise our right to freedom of expression when those digital spaces that we increasingly inhabit are actually controlled by private companies or by states who would do us no good? So imagine here the lonely LGBT and youth activist whose content is attacked, taken down, and hacked. And how is the right to information that's also identified in the UDHR, how will it be possible for the millions, actually billions, who are trapped behind firewalls and pounding the paywalls? Imagine here the criminalized blogger in these years post-Arab Spring, or the millions of refugees and displaced persons clamoring for information about the state of their families and their homelands. And how are we going to protect the right to non-discrimination in the age of the algorithm, where online bias is baked into digital prejudice and where we have very little influence and almost no power to escape? Imagine here the criminalized and the racially profiled. So as you'll see, this is not just a question of digital rights of the civil and political type, but these are also risks across the economic, social, and cultural spectrum. So now for the risks. Technology is not only upending long-held rules here, which have at least nominally protected our rights, but it's also introducing new risks, which are threatening to replicate and even exacerbate more traditional and long-standing risks to our human rights. And here I'd like to draw attention to connectivity itself, because as more and more of our ability to exercise and enjoy our rights depends upon our connectivity of the internet, depends upon our connectivity to the internet, what happens to those who are not connected? What happens to those who are facing the end of net neutrality, or who have little digital literacy, or are forcibly disconnected from the internet through the use of shutdowns, of which there have been 188 this year? We must hashtag keep it on. And paradoxically, I also want to wave a red flag about the perils of over-connectivity, and in particular, the dangers of digital identity programs that are springing up all around the world. Now, not to deny those digital identity programs, including the warehousing of our biometrics, have particular benefits for the landless, the stateless, the poor, etc. But when you use digital identity in combination with near-perfect facial recognition and the pinpoint accuracy of geolocation tools, you can imagine the potential outcomes, the very ones that the UDHR was designed to prevent. So that makes connectivity both essential to participation in modern life and also the building block for the authoritarian state. So now for the rules. Our challenge is to identify and solidify the norms, the laws, the regulations, and the innovation that can protect our human rights. The first bright spot, the Human Rights Council unanimously passed Resolution 20/8 on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. And it affirmed, as if it wasn't already obvious, that the same rights that people have offline must also be protected online. But how do we ensure that when the rules governing the enjoyment and protection of those rights have not yet even been written, or are being written by those who do not understand the implications, or worse, are willfully undermining them? It is the duty of the state to protect our rights. But country after country, member state after member state has failed us, and increasingly fails us, in democracies and non-democratic states alike. For example, in dozens of countries, encryption, which is the modern-day pathway to privacy, is now illegal or being seriously undermined, as in my own country, Australia. Companies, however, are also obligated to protect, respect, and remedy our rights. But who in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, Bangalore, or Nanjing is a human rights lawyer? Show me the tech startup that's interested in international law over market share. companies know more about their users than most sophisticated state security agencies, but who are they accountable to? And here I would like to highlight the importance of meaningful participation in the development of both policy and technology by users, the people watching the presentation online, by human rights experts, and by individuals from marginalised and at-risk communities. I also want to note here, when we're talking about companies, that tech monopolies are antithetical to the right to freedom of expression and privacy, as is the lack of transparency that is largely the hallmark of the tech sector. So, ladies and gentlemen, we know that whoever controls the future of the internet controls the future of the world. The struggle for its governance is real and epic. The Tunis Agenda for the Information Society of 2005 gave us much, but it must be renewed and revitalised in multi-stakeholder forums, including RightsCon Tunis next year. We can and deliver on a range of new and emerging norms that we're seeing through the Paris Call, the Contract for the Web, and the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. So before I end, I'd like to call out a few action items for decision makers and rule makers. Firstly, the UN itself, a message that it must modernise and move faster to remain relevant. The internet is multi-stakeholder by the nature of how it's governed. The UN should learn to be more inclusive too, like events today. We recently joined over 250 NGOs to call upon better accreditation at the NGO committee, and also to increase the budget of just 8% for human rights at the UN. The Freedom Online Coalition must live up to their members' democratic promise at home and the realpolitik of their foreign policy. And Europe, please stop allowing your companies to sell surveillance equipment to rogue customers who spy with often deadly consequences on their innocent citizens. There has to be a recognition from governments that the securitization of the internet is not actually making us safer. And to ICANN, ISOC, IETF, IEEE, we hold you accountable for your tech standards, because they will be left for generations ahead. And to Facebook, Google, Twitter, and the entire tech sector, from startups to non-traditional tech, we need you to reconsider your business model to ensure it protects our rights as a rule and not as an exception. So there's reasons to remain positive, and I'll finish in a moment. We have a digitally native population that understands these issues of data, censorship, security, etc. They will rally online for gun control as they strike against governments and schools to protect their climate. And I'm very honoured to be here on the panel with Alex. Digital language is moving with time. Privacy means control over your personal data. Non-discrimination means transparency into algorithms. And the universal nature of human rights and of the very declaration is consistent with the universal nature of the internet. This is not an issue that can be proportioned out or dealt with individually by sovereign states. The internet will reroute around censorship, and the human spirit will endure and flourish online as it has offline for centuries. We have overcome violent disruptions before. Indeed, those horrors that first gave rise to the UDHR appear on the rise again. But it's not 1948, it's 2018. The declaration has never been more important, and with our determination, it will prove even stronger and more fully realised today, tomorrow, and in 2088, 70 years from now. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the Access Now community, to my team, and our amazing partner organisations all around the world who contributed to and are the inspiration for my remarks today. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much for those insights. And as you were speaking, I got a flurry of messages on social media. We're going to put those questions to you later. But for now, I'm going to move on to our second speaker and another cutting-edge 21st century human rights issue, climate change. Are our leaders listening to the concerns of our young people, the generation who may indeed inherit an unlivable planet? Our speaker, Alex Loznak, grew up in Oregon on a farm that has been in his family for 7 generations. He saw how drought conditions, unusually hot temperatures, and abnormally large nearby wildfires are harming his home. At high school, he started a climate change club to raise awareness about the issue and later lobbied his state legislators to pass comprehensive climate legislation. Alex is one of 21 young people who in 2015 filed a lawsuit in Oregon against the US federal government to secure the legal right to a stable climate and healthy atmosphere. Alex believes that youth have a right to a stable climate system. Alex.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and I just want to thank the Human Rights Office for having me here today. It is an honor to sit on this panel. Friends, distinguished guests, and people of the world. My name is Alexander Wallace Loznak. I come from a family farm in the hills of Oregon that my family has owned for about 7 generations. I'm a 4th-year undergraduate student at Columbia University here in New York City. And as you've heard, I'm one of 21 youth plaintiffs who have pressed a case against the United States federal government for over 3 years to challenge its policies on climate change. And our case is currently pending before both the United States Supreme Court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. And I want to make the point briefly that this case we have fought against 2 different administrations of 2 different political parties. And we don't know what will be happening in about 2 years from now, but we hope that the next administration will take a different approach and come to the table with us, work together with us to move this case forward. So I'm here to speak about the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how I believe the Declaration and its principles can guide our society's response to the existential threat of climate change. Now, as we gather here today, it's clear that we live in troubled times. Large and unseasonable wildfires scorch the American West. Our neighbors in the southeastern states and Puerto Rico struggle to rebuild from storm after storm. And as climate chaos envelops my country and the world, officials at the highest levels of the U.S. government demonstrate day after day their contempt for science, the rule of law, and the truth. But despite all this, I'm here to deliver a message of hope. I draw hope from the youth of my country and the world. I draw hope from my peers in college who are dedicating their lives and careers to solving some of the most pressing social and environmental challenges facing the world. I draw hope from my 20 co-plaintiffs and youth activists across the globe who are rising to claim their stake in democracy. And I draw hope from the elders, whether they be scientists, political leaders, attorneys, who are providing the wisdom and light of their experience to guide my generation forward on its path to achieve justice in our time. As we plot our course into an uncertain future, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides a map that can help us avoid grave pitfalls. Climate change is inarguably one of the greatest threats facing my generation. Indeed, just a few weeks ago, the US President's own administration attempted to hide a devastating climate report, which found that climate change could kill thousands of Americans during my lifetime and cause untold social and economic losses. The report concluded that climate change is already beginning to make itself felt across my country, resulting in loss of life and destruction of property. And a recent United Nations report found that climate change is already wreaking havoc on global health. For instance, the number of vulnerable people exposed to heat waves increased by 157 million over the past 2 decades. As a tree farmer from the American West, I can confirm that climate change impacts, including longer and stronger wildfire seasons, have already begun to leave their mark. In the past few years, tens of thousands of acres have burned in my home community. The smoke has become so severe that I cannot even go outside. I cannot walk out the door of my home, and I cannot breathe if I go outside for weeks on end. And this is not normal weather. And it was recently reported that the smoke from the California wildfires had spread as far as New York City, tinging the sunset here with an eerie glow. In this time of crisis, we must turn to the founding documents of the international system and my own country for guidance. 2 documents sit at the top of the list: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United States Constitution. The Universal Declaration was written in the wake of the Second World War and the worst human rights violations the world had ever seen. It formed a central pillar of the post-war international architecture, designed in part to prevent such violations and crimes against humanity from ever happening again. In this context, it is clear that the existential threat to civilization posed by climate change falls well within the Universal Declaration's purview. The Declaration and the lessons of history must therefore guide our society's response to this global threat. A careful reading of the Declaration reveals that many of its provisions pertain to the climate crisis. Article 3 guarantees the rights to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 7 guarantees the right to equal protection under law. Article 17 provides that no one shall be deprived of their property without due process. And finally, Article 25 provides the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of every person's dignity and the free development of his personality. All of these rights to life, liberty, property, and human dignity and security are now infringed by climate chaos. The right of youth to equal protection is abridged because we must shoulder the disproportionate impact of climate change during our lifetimes. We can see these rights violations. We can see these rights violations in the climate impacts that the world is already feeling, and the actions that my own country's government have taken to exacerbate the problem. Now, this administration's actions have set it apart from virtually every country on Earth to hold back progress on this pressing global issue. Fortunately, the United States Constitution protects many of the same rights that the Universal Declaration announces, including due process and equal protection. That is why the federal judge overseeing our case held that, quote, where a complaint alleges that governmental action is affirmatively and substantially damaging the climate system in a way that will cause human deaths, shorten human lifespans, result in widespread damage to property, threaten human food sources, and dramatically alter the planet's ecosystem, it states a claim for a due process constitutional violation. And she went on to say that to hold otherwise would be to say that the government can knowingly poison the air that its citizens breathe or the water its citizens drink and kill its own citizens without violating the Constitution. And that is clearly not the case. So, as the gears of justice turn, we can take heart in the actions of youth around my country, and the world to reclaim democracy and respond to the present crisis. The millennials and Generation Z together now form one of the largest demographics in American history. We are already participating in democracy at higher rates than our parents did at our age. And we will continue participating, and our influence will only grow in the years to come. And we have forged ties with our contemporaries in other countries across the world. We draw inspiration from the 10,000 Australian school children who walked out of class in the past few weeks to protest their government's support for a new coal mine. We draw inspiration from youth around the world in nations as diverse as the Netherlands and Colombia, who filed human rights cases against their own governments and secured judicial declarations affirming their rights and requiring their governments to take action to mitigate carbon emissions and deforestation. Now, in the years to come, as we respond to the present crisis of climate change and strive to build a more just society, the efforts required of our generation will echo those of a previous generation of young Americans, known as the Greatest Generation, who pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression and saved the world from the tyranny of fascism and extreme nationalism. President Franklin Roosevelt, an architect of the Universal Declaration and the United Nations, once told the Greatest Generation that there is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation, he told them, has a rendezvous with destiny. My generation now faces its own rendezvous with destiny. And although the challenges that we face in the 21st century will rival those that our great-grandparents faced in the 20th, there is still hope. We have the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to guide us forward. With this fact in mind, I say with confidence that we will meet our own destiny, overcome any obstacle, and build a better future for ourselves and all those to follow us. Thank you.
Alex, thanks so much for that. Our third human rights issue is equally urgent and seemingly intractable: economic inequality. Last year, 82% of all new wealth created was captured by the 1% at the top, while the bottom 50% got nothing. Although incomes of poor people have risen worldwide, the gap between rich and poor has been growing for the past 30 years. Our speaker on this issue is Nadia Daar, an advocate for social and economic justice. She is the head of Oxfam International's Washington, D.C. office, where she works to influence international financial institutions to adopt policies and practices which promote inclusive, accountable, and sustainable development. Using insights and statistics gathered by Oxfam, Nadia will argue that poverty and extreme inequality are not inevitable byproducts of society, but unsustainable choices that are made by policy. Nadia, all yours.
Thank you, Shireen. And thank you, Assistant Secretary General, and thank you to the Office of the High Commissioner for the invitation today. It really is an honor to be here. So my kids and I have a new game we play while walking home from school. We call ourselves the Moon Chasers. Every evening, we look at the moon in the sky, tracking it as it goes behind trees, clouds, buildings. And as we walk, I tell them how the moon is so generous that she goes around saying goodnight to every single human being on this earth, every single night. Their little faces light up at the idea that girls and boys around the world, like them, are all gazing up at the moon, no matter where they live, no matter what they look like, no matter how rich or poor. We all share the moon. We all share this planet. We, the peoples, begins the United Nations Charter, all of us here together, bound by our humanity. But under the same moon, we live very different lives. Fatma, a woman in Bangladesh, works sewing clothes for export. She gets sick because she's unable to go to the toilet while working. If she fails to meet her targets, she's abused. She makes just 31 cents an hour, sometimes having to choose between food and medication for her sick mother. She and millions like her are living a crushing existence. It's a very different story for people at the top of the kinds of companies that these women work for. In fact, it would take the CEO from one of the top 5 global fashion brands just 4 days to earn what a Bangladeshi garment worker like Fatma will earn in her entire lifetime. Last year saw 2 more billionaires created every single day. It also saw a decade of progress in reducing hunger wiped away. Hunger is now rising. 42 people, just a fraction of those of you in this room today, now own as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity, 3.7 billion people. Welcome to an economy for a few super rich men that is built on the backs of hard-working women like Fatma, who are paid poverty wages and denied basic rights. Welcome to an economy that has levels of wealth never seen before in human history, yet 1 in 9 people are going to bed hungry every night. Welcome to the economy for the 1%. Don't think for a second that extreme wealth is harmless, something that's just used to buy a multi-million-dollar mansion or an original Picasso or Warhol. It's about the ability of the super rich to buy elections, to buy impunity from justice, to buy media, and to help make sure that their wealth keeps begetting more wealth by buying favorable laws. Laws and policies that give them even more financial and political power to continue influencing policies that work for them and disfavor the other 99% of humanity. It is this vicious cycle that further entrenches inequality. Our tax systems are a clear manifestation of this. The 2016 Panama Papers that you'll all remember were a big scandal for a reason. Africa loses $14 billion in tax revenues due to the super rich using tax havens. Oxfam has calculated that this would be enough to pay for the health care that could save the lives of 4 million children and employ enough teachers to get every African child into school. It's the same elite and structure that depress wages and keep workers from organizing to ensure their rights are protected and that they're able to live a decent life. The IMF's own research shows that the recent decline in trade union organization has been linked to the rise in inequality, as workers lose bargaining power and more of the value of production goes to profits and the owners of capital. Now, we can go on with our days believing that this extreme inequality is normal, that some people are super rich and some people are extremely poor. Maybe some people work really hard and some people don't. Some people are just really unlucky. Gosh, I hear that word a lot, unlucky, describing people who are born into poverty and whose grandchildren go on to be born poor. But the truth is that this isn't accidental or bad luck, nor is it inevitable. This is man-made, and I do mean man-made. We know it is women who bear the brunt of poverty and inequality most, who at home take on the burden of unpaid care work, and who outside the home get paid less to work more. Economic and gender inequality are intricately connected, and we cannot address either in isolation. 70 years ago, the world came together to agree on the monumental and unprecedented Declaration of Human Rights. And we've made tremendous progress, all of which is worthy of celebration. And all of us here today believe that this set of rights is not merely aspirational. These are rights that we should all be guaranteed. We all deserve these rights. Yet they're severely under threat by the crisis of extreme inequality. This is not humanity's inevitable fate. It is a result of policy choices. And that means we can make a fundamentally different kind of choice for the kind of economy we want to see. This crisis has a clear path out, a path that some governments are already taking. Look at South Korea, that has increased the minimum wage, is taxing rich corporations and individuals more, and spending that money on universal social protection. Look at Senegal, that spends the 13th highest proportion of its budget on education in the world, and has one of the largest safety net programs in Africa. Look at Iceland, that has taken the bold move of making it illegal to pay women less than men. Fighting inequality is not some utopian ideal. It's the path being taken by some governments, breaking a path from the global norm, showing that another way, a more human economy, is possible and achievable. Oxfam and Development Finance International's new commitment to reducing inequality index looks at 157 countries' policy choices on areas demonstrated to reduce inequality: progressive taxation, strong spending on health, education, and social protection, and progressive labor policies, particularly those that benefit women. This message is most fundamentally to governments. The time has come to leave behind the economy of the 1% and build an economy that works for everyone. We need you to take the bold action needed and make the policy choices to set us on the path to achieving SDG 10 on reduced inequalities. But this message is also for communities, activists, academics, social movements, diplomats and technocrats too. We must all come together to recognize that so many of our struggles and policy objectives are rooted in the same problem of inequality. Donors must support governments in their fight against inequality. The IMF and the World Bank can no longer continue with traditional austerity advice and business as usual. They must put their actions where their mouth is and help countries build the political will to make the right policy choices. We need to urgently move the entire UN system behind a deliberate and concerted agenda to tackle economic inequality. Your commitment to human rights and achieving the SDGs depends on it. And we need to do a better job of linking the human rights agenda with inequality and economic decision-making. It's not acceptable that key international financial institutions refuse to integrate human rights into their policies. One has to wonder why that is. Is it perhaps the hushed acceptance that the dominant economic model does not actually work for everyone? We cannot accept that. We should all be working towards an economy that works for everyone, one where everyone, no matter where they live, no matter what they look like, no matter how rich or poor, can realize their human rights, and not just the few. A more human economy. Thank you.
Nadia, thank you so much for your insights. I'm going to turn to all of you in a moment and ask for your very smart questions. It's a big auditorium. I imagine there's a lot of them. But before I do, I'm just going to take some questions that we've been getting on social media. And there's still time to write those in on Twitter. Just use Ask Human Rights as the hashtag. I'll start with you, Brett, and I'm going to really resist the very strong urge I have to abuse my moderator position and ask you about my internal struggle with Facebook and whether I should quit Facebook. But there was a question that was along the same lines, which is about Silicon Valley, and how do we convince Silicon Valley to respect human rights in social media, and how do we convince them that human rights are even important?
Thank you, and thanks for resisting the question. So I think it's important to note at the outset that technology is actually just not made in Silicon Valley, that there's many different technology centers. If you look at China, for instance, like Silicon Valley has very little impact on the platforms that are being used there. So I think we need to think about this as a global question, not just like how do we think about, Sheryl Sandberg or Jack Dorsey at Twitter. I think the sort of the central problem here is the business model, as I mentioned in my remarks, is that the data collection is essentially our very identity, and it will be increasingly so. And so how do we force companies to think about a shift in the business model in a way that enables greater ownership, greater consent, greater participation by individuals? How do we actually move to a more self-sovereign approach so that people have control of their data on their handsets? We obviously need big tech to be more transparent. We need to understand how the algorithm works. We need to understand when governments are requesting data from tech companies. We've seen the issuing of transparency reports over the last couple of years, which is also a result of user demand. And I think that would be the other point. It's not just about data policy transparency. It's also about how do we as citizens and as users demand participation and demand practice from the tech sector, because they've really got away with a lot over the last 10 years or so. So I think there's a real opportunity for that. And then I would say that what we're seeing now is this idea about antitrust, is about, does the tech sector need to be regulated in a way that would protect our rights? And we're seeing within the US and other countries this push towards regulation. And I think that's largely or in part a result of the fact that tech companies have not self-regulated, not properly self-regulated. And so we see this denial, this abuse of rights that are happening all over the place. So we need to have greater participation. We need to think deeply about regulation. And we need the tech sector itself, whether it be in Silicon Valley or in other places, to understand the human rights implications of not just their policies and their practices, but their code.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think a lot of the questions that we were getting on social media, in fact, for the three of you, were about practical solutions to the sort of problems that you're raising on the podium. And so, Alex, the one question that came in from you, from different people saying exactly the same thing, really, is what are some of the practical examples that young people, initiatives that they can get involved in? Because you're someone who clearly got very involved at a young age. But what can someone sitting, in a faraway country do? Sure.
Well, I mean, I would say start small and then work your way toward bigger initiatives. I recognize that not every young person sitting watching this program is going to file a lawsuit against their sovereign nation. Some may, and that and many have in other countries and been successful in that. But I think start at a local level. Start within your school, for instance. I mean, when I was in high school, I really worked on trying to get solar panels installed at the school. So working on projects at the community level, I think, and at the local government level, for instance, I think that's a great place to start. But I think that it does have to be, it does need to go beyond just your own individual personal choices. Obviously, recycle, but it needs to go beyond that. And I think the place to start is probably at the community level.
What do you say to people who feel like people watching that maybe feel a bit disempowered because they're the 99% that don't feel like they can really change policy?
Well, I think as I mentioned in my comments, particularly toward the younger audience, there is strength in numbers, and both in the U.S. and globally, the younger demographics actually wield enormous power that we haven't quite realized that we have yet. But I think we're getting there, and so I think this is actually a moment to feel not disempowered, but to feel empowered and engaged, and to really seize the moment.
Thanks for that. An easy one for you, Nadia. Not at all. So there's no human right that says people can't be rich. As long as everyone has an adequate standard of living, why should it matter if the 1% continue to get richer? Is one of the questions.
Thanks, Shireen. It's a good question, and one that I began to address a little bit in the speech. But as I said, it's not that getting wealthy in itself is a problem. It's two things. It's making sure that rich individuals and corporations are paying their fair share, which is a major problem to our ability as countries and as people to capture the revenues that we need in order to redistribute wealth in the form of universal access to quality healthcare and education, and ensure that we have a good, strong social protection system in countries. And then on the other side of it, it's not just about capturing the necessary revenues, but it's all and people paying their fair share. But it's also about the fact that there is a dominance of state and political elite capture in a lot of countries. And what we find, actually, we've just put out a report in Latin America that shows how various elites have managed to capture various particular tax policies in Latin America. And there is a very strong connection between that state capture and inequality, because there is this tremendous ability of corruption to thrive when there is such deep inequality in countries. And that's the problem with this extreme inequality, is the ability for the super rich and corporations to be capturing policies and laws that favor them and continue in the cycle of entrenched inequality.
Thank you, well explained. Okay, now all of you, time for your questions. If you can just raise your hand as high as you can so I can see you, and if you could also introduce yourself, please, when you speak. The gentleman at the front, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much for convening the meeting and for the panelists for these enlightening presentations. My name is Rodrigo Carazo. I am the permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations, and all three presentations, of course, touch base with us and with the current state, not only of our country or region, but of the world. Of course, we can make comments to the three presentations, and most intensively to that of Ms. Nadia Daar, which reflects on this inequality in the world. Climate change, effects of climate change. Alex, the state of the environment, the mess in which we have converted the environment, is not one thing that threatens your basic rights. It already affects them, and you have reacted to that circumstance. How can other people react to that? How can the younger generations, your generation, and the ones that come behind, make that radical change? The United Nations will still be there. The framework of the Human Rights Convention will still be there. Changes may operate at that level if you believe so. If you just discard them, go and do other things, because you know the answers. Your generation has the needs, feel the needs, and will know how to react to them. Please enlighten us on that. 119 countries as of now, including Costa Rica, have in their constitution the provision that the right to a healthy and ecologically balanced environment for all of its residents is a human right, a fundamental human right in the case of my country. Is that enough? It's not, but it has made a difference so far. So, yes, I have questions for the three of you, but let me focus on Alex's at this time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Alex.
All right. Well, there's a lot there to respond to. So I mean, I think where I mean, part of this question seems to be where should we start? You know, in the sense that you have young people around the world looking at this problem of climate change that seems so intractable, and we're trying to figure out what do we do, where do we start to work on this, and you know, and you mentioned the United Nations framework. I actually would I would argue that I think that the place to start may not be at the international level, but may actually be at the national level. I mean, we've had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the treaty signed in 1992, I believe, and the conferences of the parties that have happened pretty much every year since then to try to someday negotiate a legally binding global treaty to solve climate change. And the progress there from as I've studied the history and followed these negotiations since I started paying attention to these things when I was a little younger, the progress has been very slow. It took over 20 years to finally negotiate the Paris Agreement, which is non-binding and which my own country has announced that it plans to leave, and that most countries within the Paris Agreement, I just saw recently that there was a report that said that most countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement are not meeting their own targets that they submitted. So I think that the place to start for young people who are wanting to solve this problem is at the national level of their own countries, and to push their own governments in a direction of reducing carbon emissions so that they can then go to the international stage and say, here's what we've done, here's the progress that we've made. And I think that's where some of those cases that I mentioned at the national level, for instance, in the Netherlands and Colombia, where you've had cases brought partly by youth under human rights theories, including international human rights treaties, or the Convention on Rights of the Child, for instance, but taking those international human rights principles that are embodied in the Universal Declaration and other treaties, and then achieving victories within their own countries on that level, so that then they can go to the international stage and say, we need to build on the framework created by the Paris Agreement and other international climate treaties that are a step in the right direction but not strong enough, and we need really more accountability and concrete action from nations, and they need to be held accountable.
Thanks, Alex. Other questions? Maybe the lady in the green.
Thank you. Cynthia Stewart from the International Federation on Aging. And as the preamble states, that we are all concerned about the rights of all humans. But in 1948, we weren't quite so aware of the longevity revolution. And I would say that older persons are much more disadvantaged, particularly in the digital age, and keeping up and having accessible technologies for them, as well as being victims of abuse. Economically, of course, across the ages. And we also know from the climate change reports that those most or least advantaged are most impacted with climate change. It seems to me we need to address what the document does and doesn't do, as you stated at the outset, and perhaps we need something in addition to address the universal rights of older persons. What do you think?
Thank you for that question. It sort of cuts across all three of you. Maybe, Brett, do you want to take a stab at it to begin with?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking actually as the three of us were speaking is the intersectionality of all of these issues, is that like the UN itself and many governments, including the Costa Rican government and my own, are thinking about these things in silos. And we can no longer think about them like that because it doesn't make sense. There's an identity of you can be a climate activist, you can be a woman, you can be living in poverty, and you can be old at the same time. In fact, that's exactly what the identity of many people are. So how do we, as people who are thinking actively about the application and the enjoyment of human rights going forward respond and recognise to the connection between different parts of our identity, the ageing population, as you say, and also not only the ageing population, but also the fact that the majority of the world is under 24 as well. So we've got this kind of like odd dichotomy happening. But I would say that the issue around digital literacy for older people is essential. There are many programs around the world that are particularly focused on how to ensure that the older generation is able to participate online, as participation online becomes everything and will be everything. It'll be very, very difficult to participate in modern society without being on. So this issue of digital inclusion is key, which is like, how do we identify, how do we work actively with marginalised populations from LGBT to old people and have active programs? And there are many programs happening nationally. I think Internet Society does great work around that as well, but it needs to be a whole of whole approach with particular strategies identified for different target groups, recognising that they're in many groups at the same time. Thank you.
Nadia.
Thank you, and thank you for raising that issue. It's an issue that I didn't touch upon also in my presentation, but was about the compounding inequalities that exist. I spoke a little bit about gender, but of course race, ethnicity, age, even marital status in some countries makes a big difference in terms of the kinds of inequalities that one faces, and it also, therefore, promotes the importance of a universal approach as well. So let's just look at education, health, and social protection, and a strong social protection that can support our elderly in various countries, which is so critical. This kind of universality is a great equalizer. We talk about all the problems of inequality. I talked about all the stats. What are some of the solutions? I touched on them, policy solutions. Health and education and a foundational, strong social protection system are incredible equalizers in a society. And it's something that we're very proud and pleased that the SDGs that were agreed in 2015 really touch on this universal approach to these types of protections, as does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's just so incredibly important. I want to take this opportunity to talk about how relevant it is for all children to be able to access education, all people to be able to access healthcare, and not simply thinking, as we're talking about the SDGs and we're thinking about different ways to fund the SDGs. I know a lot of people in this room are working on those kinds of issues. We're thinking about the private sector, for example, and the private sector has a critical role to play in fulfilling the SDGs, but we can't turn to them as a panacea for everything. For example, when trying to meet basic human rights and a universal approach to health and education, those are things that we still must rely on governments to provide. So, for example, even with education, where we think about things like low-fee private schools as a way to target poor populations and that the private sector can fulfill that for us. Think about the fact that in Ghana, for example, the poorest families will use 40% of their household income, sending just one of their children, usually the boy, in their family, to one of those low-cost private schools. And so it's just so important for education to be free, to be quality, and to be universal. And it's the same thing for healthcare, where the World Health Organization estimates that 100 million people every year are thrown into extreme poverty just because of out-of-pocket healthcare payments. That's crazy. That's nuts. I mean, that's really what comes down to it when we think about universality. It's about ensuring everyone has that access and that it's quality and free.
Thank you for that. Do you have something to say, Alex? Okay, we're going to move on. Maybe, in fact, we'll take 2 or 3 questions so we can... The lady in the purple there in the first row.
Hello. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tenzin Tela, representing the Tibet. First of all, we Tibetans are celebrating the 29th anniversary of the conferment of the prestigious Nobel Peace Prize upon His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1989, and I take this opportunity to congratulate him on this auspicious day. Also, around the world, today, people are commemorating the 70th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, my Tibetan brothers and sisters are still suffering under Chinese communist rule due to lack of human rights in Tibet. 164 self-immolations from 2011 to until now. As per today's topic and of discussion, youth have a right to a stable climate system. Geographically, Tibet is known as the roof of the world and is also considered as the third pole after Arctic and Antarctica. Tibet was once an independent country and currently an occupied country by Chinese communists. The Chinese communists keeps this deforesting, mining, and dumping waste on the grassland of Tibet. About 46% of Asia's freshwater resources are from Tibet. But China is diverting the rivers to the other parts of China and building dams which threaten the livelihood of other parts of Asia. Due to excessive mining and diversion of the Dichu River, a landslide occurred in the Polu district of Tibet, and hence an entire monastery and the village were submerged underwater. In short, China is not only exploiting human rights in Tibet and causing them to self-immolate, it is also gravely harming the environment and contributing substantially to the global warming. Finally, I'm not here to ask any question. I'm here to urge the United Nations, not just as a Tibetan, but as a global citizen, to take measures against China to stop it from destroying the roof of the world and its environment, and to stop polluting the 46% of Asia's fresh water resources. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your statement. Another question. There's one in the back, right at the back, the lady at the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Lobi Redhawk. I'm here representing Shulamith Koenig, who is the founder of PDHRE, People's Movement for Human Rights Learning. For some of you, I was able to distribute a pledge for UDHRE's 40th anniversary. I'd like to read it, and my question would basically be to all of us here in the room, physically and digitally, and those of you on the panel. Will we raise our voices locally, use this pledge in conversations so that we may indeed begin to live human rights as a way of life? Let us weave a new political culture guided by human rights as a way of life. We are the human rights generation.
I'm so sorry to cut you off, just because I think we can all read the statement.
Well, they all don't have it.
We can definitely circulate it, just because if you read it all, then we won't have time for other people, and there's so many people in the room who have questions.
It is so very short, but if you would just
we take your question, though.
I thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Other questions? I have one here on the left.
There we go. Okay. Hi, I'm Callan Locks. I'm a representative from the Modern Day Prep Global Institute and also Pathways to Peace. And my question is, how do you all feel about a collaboration between civil society and the United Nations in order to create a universal global human rights certification that youth can achieve in order to educate properly and get involved in human rights issues?
Thank you. I think we'll probably take one more, as the first one was a statement. Go ahead.
From Kalasa Union. We're a minority Hindu and the Adi Shavite community within India and abroad, and are facing severe oppression and persecution within our own country and online. 90% of our females in our group in the ASMT community report having experienced sexual harassment online. Many of these victims are young girls, around 15 to 16 years old. This harassment is perpetrated in Tamil, English, Hindi, and Kannada in various formats, including unwanted, offensive, sexual, explicit comments, SMS, and emails, offensive and inappropriate advances on social networking sites such as Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, and Instagram. Social media, unfortunately, is the only voice we have, yet is a double-edged sword. Cyber-trolling and online hate speech is increasingly becoming a big threat. Oddly, the more we share about our persecution online, the more oppression we face. This is often highly organized and coordinated and is an extension of mainstream media manipulation. How can this be addressed at a macro level?
some really easy questions for you over there. Some of them statements, but also some questions about weaving a new political culture of human rights and some others. Who wants to? Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there, and I may not be able to address everything. But I did like the comment by the woman over here about having a certification for youth to be able to teach and engage with human rights. And I think that part of the path that many of us who are working on these issues begins with education, including formal education, including classes that we've taken in school and university, etc., but also a path of self-education and seeking out the knowledge that we need as individuals and as a group in order to be effective advocates for our rights and the rights of others. And so I'm very supportive of the construction of new platforms, including through civil society in partnership with the United Nations, that can allow youth, in a formal classroom setting or as individuals seeking out information on their own through the internet, to learn about these issues and be able to engage with these issues. I mean, for me personally, I took an interest in some of these issues, environmental issues in particular, at a young age, and I sought out information. I read books, and eventually that led me into more of a formal educational path to go to university all the way here in New York City. But I think absolutely education and resources available for youth to access is extremely important.
Brett, any quick comments?
I just want to note the woman from Tibet, and thank you very much for your comments. I also saw a group of Tibetans outside protesting the decision makers inside this building. So obviously the issue of online harassment and persecution is a real one, and there are many communities from the Rohingya to your own who have suffered real-world consequences of online persecution because, and often it's the people who are the most marginalised, are the least able to defend themselves or to respond. I would say that there's a gendered element to this as well, and I'm really pleased that we've talked about gender and digital and persecution, both on and offline, because it's central to today's understanding of the human rights agenda. The problem that we see is that tech companies are the ones who are now being held accountable and responsible for the content on their platforms. And the sort of privatization of enforcement is extremely problematic because, as I said, you don't have the human rights training, you don't have the human rights processes. You have an army of censors, literally, many of whom are located in the Philippines, who are making decisions about what is legitimate content, what is unlawful content, what is content that incites violence. And so there is a very, very difficult conundrum here because, as you said to me earlier, the internet is both our lifeline and the place where we're persecuted. And we see it ourselves on our digital security helpline at Access Now, where we have, doing literally 150 cases a month of people who are persecuted online, either through technical means or via content. And so I'm pleased to talk to you more. There's a lot of conversations happening within Facebook, Google, Twitter, within civil society, within systems. There's a lot that's also being done wrong as well, because in order to determine the unlawfulness, the illegality, etc. of content, you need to monitor the networks. So you need a surveillance regime. Then you need a censorship regime to take it off. And often you need a propaganda regime as well to put alternative content in there. So you're kind of creating this disaster. I'm not underplaying the reality of online persecution, and it needs to be addressed, and it is, but it's going to take some time just because of the stickiness and the complexity of it.
Nadia, you have 1 minute.
Right. In that 1 minute, let me just say then what I think that the UN and the multilateral institutions that we have can be doing. So, you mentioned an initiative on human rights training and teaching, for example, but one of the things that connects a lot of the issues that we're talking about today is the importance of having space for civil society and for citizens to speak up and to speak out and to be able to hold their governments accountable when they're failing them, whether it's politically or economically, socially, culturally. And so what we would urge is for the UN to promote and protect civic space around the world that is currently and is continuing increasingly to be under threat. So that would be my last word today.
Yeah, a message we definitely echo from Amnesty International as well. I'm going to try and take 2 super short questions, but only if they're really, really short. So perhaps the young gentleman there, and I know that you're very eager as well, sir.
Hi. Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Ishan Sharma. I'm from the Modern Day Prep Global Institute Pathways to Peace. My question is basically for anyone or to all the panel, people in the panels. Do you have any specific ideas for a young person like me to best ensure human rights and its agenda being upheld in my own community?
Great question. And very lastly, as short as you can, please.
I'm Johnny Tuhaika. I'm speaking on behalf of West Papuan mission to the UN. You know very well West Papua is close to the world. No one is reporting from there. No one is allowed to write any report. Social media is the only way to communicate with them. And the government of Indonesia is cracking down on those who are posting on Facebook or Twitter. And Brett, you are Australian. And do you support a universal encryption, whatever, maybe crazy idea, but do you support it? So that all countries, including Australia and Indonesia, can be subjected to a same standard of transparency and accountability?
Okay, so Brett, maybe you can answer that, and Alex, just take a last shot at the young people in human rights protection.
Rather than the creation of a new treaty, which I think would end up as a race to the bottom, I would much prefer to see the application of existing standards to the current digital environment. There's many countries like West Papua, or many peoples within countries that are using the online sphere as their only space. And so organisations like ours and many around us are trying to keep that civic space as open as possible. The idea is that it's not just about civic space now, it's about digital civic space. And so how do as I said before, how do we ensure we have freedom of expression, opinion, association, privacy in the digital environment and the real world consequences of that? I think it's about the application of the existing treaties and the existing bodies. And there's many ways in which obviously we can do that, and there are also many ways in which we're failing as well. So happy to talk to you more afterwards about the situation in West Papua for sure.
And to the question about what are the best ways for young people to get involved and in promoting a human rights agenda in their own communities, I mean, I think that the key word is contained within the question itself, and that is community. That it cannot be just individual actions and individual lifestyle choices, although those decisions are important. I think in any human rights issue, whether it be the environmental issues, which have been my focus, or any broader human rights or political issues, the community level is a very good place to start. And I mentioned the example of when I was a little bit younger, putting forward this idea of putting up solar panels on the school. And I think that could be a template for any kind of initiative at the community level to really put forward a proposal, figure out, who's the decision maker or the decision making body. In that instance, it would be the school board, and school boards obviously have influence over a lot of policies that affect young people in their school districts. Certainly not just limited to the environment. What are the other local government or other decision makers that that are responsible for making the decision put forward what your idea is, and the worst thing that can happen is they say no. And I think that there is a fear of failure that has to be overcome in order to be an effective youth advocate for human rights. You know, when we put forward this idea to install solar panels, everybody in that group was very excited about it. We wrote an amazing proposal, but eventually it was not accepted. But going through that experience of putting forward an idea at the local community level, the local government level, even though it didn't end up achieving the vision that we had sort of laid out, I think that the experience of going forward and putting forward the proposal was an incredibly valuable one that has really set me up and sort of given me the tools that I need to go forward and try and put forward ideas, again at the community level and also at the national level and even at international fora such as the United Nations.
Thank you, Alex. Great advice, and also a great way to end this event, because we started with this question of whether the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is still relevant, and clearly it is still relevant. The question is one of whether we can implement it, and it seems that the only way to do that is for us all to not be indifferent to human rights violations and the violations of the principles. And just by you turning up today and asking these questions about what can you do as a young person to defend human rights, that's very heartening, and working as a community is key. So just before I hand over to Assistant Secretary General Andrew Gilmour, let me just thank our three panelists for a really enlightening discussion.
And thank you, Shireen, and to the panelists. I just wanted to really express my gratitude to all of you for coming today. The message we've been putting across, and including from the Secretary General and the High Commissioner, is that we really are living in an era of backlash against human rights, against the backlash of the undeniable progress that had been made in the last 3 decades until now. And we see that backlash in many ways. We see it at headquarters. Just today, our office was prevented from speaking in the Security Council about the human rights situation in the Democratic Republic of Korea. So just of that, and our already rather meager budget, there are efforts to cut that. There are many, many attempts, but more importantly is the way the backlash is manifested on the ground. We see so much how human rights defenders are denigrated, humiliated, so harassed, put under surveillance, and worse, put in jail at times. We see how in country after country there are laws being passed deliberately designed to prevent human rights defenders and NGOs from being able to operate, from being able to raise funding. So in answer to our question about how young people like him could help respond, I think it's clear that our generation has messed things up, both environmentally and indeed in terms of human rights. And basically we look at you and people of your generation to try to put things to right. And how to do it. There are many ways. Our motto this year is stand up for someone's rights. And of course, it's much easier in some places to do that than in others. And we're not encouraging people to stand up and do things that is going to put themselves into danger, as happens in far too many countries. Not a day goes by when I'm not absolutely amazed and just bewildered with admiration for the courage of human rights defenders who, in environments of astonishing danger, continue to stand up for their rights and for other people's rights. But at local level and in countries where it's reasonably safe to do so, just encourage you to do everything you can at community level, at local level, with local politicians, local media, whatever. Just spread the word, because not enough people know about the articles in the Universal Declaration. And if people don't know what's in it, they can't be expected to defend even their own rights, let alone those of other people. So this is what this sort of event is intended to do, and thank all of you very much indeed for coming.